I predict that the U.S. economy will crash within the next 3 years, in part to lackluster incomes, overvalued housing and technology industries, and foreign financial and political instability. According to U.S. Census Bureau figures, in 1973, the average American worker made $53,294. And as of 2014, this number has dwindled down to $50,383. And since 1973, America has experienced a five-fold inflation rate. Using an inflation calculator provided by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, that same 1973 income would be the equivalent of roughly $284,000 present day. These figures imply that the average American worker in 1973 had greater purchasing power and perhaps even a higher standard of living. But this also means that today, working Americans are dealing with a fairly stagnant income despite the rising cost of living. These numbers are rather surprising, but what's even worse is the number of Americans who are not equipped with emergency savings. This year, Forbes, one of the most prominent financial magazines, reported that 63% of Americans do not have enough savings to even remotely offset the costs of a job or tire replacement. And by that, I mean they don't have enough savings to cover a $500 or $1,000 emergency. In addition, a majority of the 63% would have to resort to credit cards, family favors, and budget extracting in order to cover these costs. Even the most minor waves of job layoffs could have a rippling effect on the American economy. And although many of us recall the hard times our families faced in 2008, U.S. policymaking and financial responsibility does not seem to have improved much. Not only this, but the newest American workers are entering the workforce with the heaviest student loan debts this nation has ever seen. And although in a perfect world, I'd like to think that many of us fall into zero or at most the $25,000 range, we can't forget about our friends who are accruing hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt in private schools. And while a good portion of students are attempting to pay off their debts, the Wall Street Journal reported that over 7 million students defaulted on their loans. That means over 7 million students have gone at least a year without making any payments on their federal student loans. In 2014, there were 40 million Americans with student debt, amounting the national debt crisis to a whopping $1.2 trillion. Just let that number sink in, and also be grateful to go to Cal Poly. In terms of U.S. industries, Fortune reports that analysts reveal a 25 to 65% overvaluement in the U.S. real estate market. Unlike the 2008 housing bubble, this new housing bubble isn't due to irresponsible mortgage lending. Instead, it's simply overestimated through capital and delusional investor eyes. The analysts claim that the numbers do not reflect the true value of a single-family housing market, which reflect the average buyer's down payment and debt-to-income ratio. Once again, recalling 2008, we can remember how dangerous housing bubbles can be. Now, how likely is it that our generation will be able to afford homes when our wages and salaries are not proportionate with the cost of living? And what happens when we owe ridiculous amounts of money in the name of education? Financial irresponsibility is rampant throughout our country, whether it's individual decision-making or overvalued industries, which brings me to the other bubble, technology. As we all have seen, the tech industry has grown exponentially in recent decades. Silicon Valley is notorious for its startups that have million and billion dollar valuations. It's become this crazy Facebook and Twitter effect. And while many companies have been successful, has anyone noticed that we went from saying there's an app for that to I don't have any storage to download a new app? Those statements alone exemplify the technology bubble. Too many ideas and too much funding competing for a few spots. Lastly, on an international scale, China, the second largest economy in the world and our largest trading partner, is experiencing financial woes. Their era of devaluation and mass production is coming to an end. And this will have a direct impact on our economy. Additionally, the European Union is facing both debt and humanitarian crises beyond belief. And in the midst of it all, a British exit could make the whole thing collapse. Although all these claims may seem rather pessimistic, these numbers are real, and I want to emphasize the potential instability you may encounter upon graduation. In addition, many of these trends parallel with those prior to other market collapses and economic downfalls.
Well, you start off with a nice depressing proposition. There you go. We got that going for us, but it's pretty clear. The secondary points are previewed as kind of part of the argument, and it feels a little bit like you're rushing through the way that you're going to develop them. And one of the ways that I think you can tell that it's being rushed is when you get to the main body of the speech. I can't really distinguish the first point from anything else that's being said. A lot of data starts getting presented, and I'm not exactly sure how all of that data is supposed to be processed and put together and what inference I'm supposed to be making from it. I got a little bit clearer transition when you got to the housing issue. It still was a bit ambiguous. When you got to the tech bubble, that I thought was much clearer. Then I knew where you were at that point. And then the China issue, I thought you signposted that pretty well. But the first couple of points, it just seemed like you dove into them, started piling on data, and I know you're there somewhere. There you are. and before you're explaining what the issue is and what the claims are, and I think that's a little bit problematic. On the other hand, I thought that you had a variety of data. Most of it seemed like it was very consistently cited in terms of sources. I think you could probably use a little bit more in a couple of spots, but I thought the student debt issue is nicely documented. I think that's pretty good. The housing issue is a little bit ambiguous. I'm not exactly sure what it is that's happening in China and Europe that are going to be so threatening to us. I think you kind of stumbled through. I know there are issues, but I don't think they're explained, and I don't really know who it is that I'm listening to and what information it is that I'm supposed to make this inference from, and that's a little bit problematic there. For the most part, I thought it was delivered pretty well. I find the argument to be convincing at the end when there's a summary and you kind of remind us the point that you're trying to make. I just thought when you're making it, you got a little caught up with all the evidence that you're presenting without giving us kind of the explanation about how this connects and what points it proves, which leads to the conclusion that you're talking about. And you got a 3-year limit on this. We ought to have some sell-by date stuff on this information. In other words, why 3 years? What is it that's going to happen in a year in Europe that's going to cause this to happen, or next year are they expecting there to be twice as many defaults on student loans or something like that? You've got kind of a threshold argument, so I need some threshold information. All right, thank you.